What's up, guys? This is Blake, host of the That You May Know Him podcast. And on today's episode, I had the privilege of having a conversation with Dr. Jen Rosner. She's an assistant affiliate professor of systematic theology at Fuller Theological Seminary, and she also holds academic posts at the Messianic Jewish Theological Institution, Azusa Pacific University, and the King's University. More importantly, for this episode, she's also the author of the just-released book, Finding Messiah, A Journey Into the Jewishness of the Gospel. If you listen to this podcast at all, you know I read a lot of books, particularly a lot of theological books, and I have not been impacted by a theological book like I was by this one in quite some time. I think it's very timely. I think its message is important, and I think it fits really well into something we talk about a lot on this podcast, which is namely, if you want to understand the gospel really, really well, you have to start by understanding the story of Scripture. The more you understand the story of Scripture, the more you will understand and love and appreciate what God has done for us in Jesus. Look, the story of Scripture has much to do with God's covenant with the Jewish people. And like Dr. Rosner says in the book, if the gospel we preach has nothing to do with God's covenant with Israel, then we've missed something profound. So look, I highly recommend this book. It'll be one of our recommended resources going forward, and we'll do more podcasts on it in the future. But for now, I wanted to bring you this episode, and Dr. Rosner was nice enough to give us an hour of her time just in the week leading up to the release of her book. So enjoy this episode, get the book if you can, and thank you so much for tuning in to That You May Know Him. Well, I'm happy to be joined today by Dr. Jen Rosner. She is the author of a book that just came out yesterday. It's called Finding Messiah, A Journey Into the Jewishness of the Gospel. Dr. Rosner, I've really been looking forward to this. I'm really thankful and glad that you wanted to come on the show. First of all, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you. It's really an honor to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Good. Great. Well, you know, there's tons to talk about, so we'll just dive in. Could you tell the listeners, first of all, your story? Your story has so much to do with the book, and your story is an intimate part of the book. So would you just tell us your story and who you are and how you got here?
Yeah, it's a big question, and it is very interwoven in the book. One of the fun things about this particular book, Finding Messiah, was interweaving my story with, theological, biblical, historical reflections. This is my first book that is not strictly an academic book, and it's quite frankly the most vulnerable book I've ever written. I've never shared, in my academic writing about my life and my marriage and my kids, and so it was fun, and it's also a bit nerve-wracking, right, for all these people to just like know our story, but in fact that was part of the impetus for writing the book, was wanting to tell my story. It felt meaningful to tell the story and to tell it in the context of wrestling through issues related to biblical interpretation and contemporary religious practice and discipleship and those kinds of things. So I'll try to give kind of a quick version. I was raised in a Jewish home in Northern California. With a pretty strong sense of Jewish identity. Both of my parents are Jewish, had been raised in the Jewish community in Los Angeles, but we did not have a lot of Jewish community to speak of growing up. So we practiced some Jewish holidays in the home, not super traditional or observant, but certainly like the Jewish identity piece was there. And I went off to college at a large public state school in California. And it just so happened, right, that that a lot of my friends were Christians. And it was a time at this particular school where there was this kind of Christian explosion, like the Campus Crusade chapter went from 30 students to 500 students in a 5-year period. And that's when I was there. So there was just a lot going on in terms of Christianity and Christian energy at my, very secular college. And so college, my undergraduate years became a real searching time for me. I did spend a little bit of time with the Hillel student group, which is the Jewish student group on campus, but
Okay.
But they were not kind of wrestling with the same theological questions that I was already wrestling with as an undergrad. And I found that Christians were, that there was a lot more
Yeah.
God talk in the Christian ministries and churches that I eventually started attending in college.
Yeah.
And so, as I said, college was a searching time for me, a wrestling time. I
Yeah.
had all these Christian friends around me. I had never heard the gospel until I was in college. Like my best friend growing up was Catholic, but again, like more of a cultural Catholic. And so I really
Yeah.
did not know like who the person of Jesus was until my college years. And that became a central point of kind of exploration and wrestling for me. I was a
Yeah.
political science major in college
Huh.
and planning to go on to law school, which like everybody in my department was doing. And it was
Sure.
my last year in college that through a set of circumstances, I ended up coming to a place of belief. Like, yes, I think that this person, Jesus, is who he said he was, and that means something for me and
Yeah.
for everyone else. And so at
Yeah.
that point, I totally changed directions and I went to divinity school at Yale Divinity School instead
Wow.
of law school. And
Yeah.
I just felt like a kid in a candy shop, like taking classes on systematic theology and church history and biblical
Yeah.
languages and just kind of soaking it all in. And at that point, I was, I had no idea what to do with the Jewish piece of my identity. So when I became a follower
Yeah.
of Jesus, I just put it on the shelf because I didn't know any other Jewish followers of Jesus. I didn't know of
Yeah.
Messianic Judaism, nothing. And so I just went into the church world and I kind of bounced around in different denominations and found a lot of richness there. And
Yeah.
then it was actually at the end of my div school years that the Jewish piece, again, through a really fascinating set of circumstances, began to resurface. And I began to realize that I had left something behind and something that was really fundamental in terms of my identity and self-understanding. And so then I came
Wow.
back to California,
Yeah.
began my PhD program at Fuller Seminary,
Yeah.
and these issues just spilled out into my doctoral
Yeah.
work, which
Yeah.
was again another kind of searching season in terms of now what does it look like to be Jewish and to be a follower of Jesus. And I for
Yeah.
the first time had some mentors in that.
Yeah.
Mark Kinzer, who's a leading Messianic Jewish theology, very quickly became a mentor for me after I was introduced to him during my doctoral program. And my
Yeah.
doctoral dissertation, which is now published as my first book, which is called Healing the Schism, really
Yeah.
dives into this remarkable era that we're living in with regard to Judaism and Christianity and these two religious traditions kind of rethinking one another after centuries of hostility and self-definition
Yeah.
in mutual
Yeah.
exclusion from the other. And so again, I think at that point, for sure, if not before then, my story became very intertwined with this particular set of theological issues. And ever
Yeah.
since then, I have been teaching and writing on these kinds of topics. This troubled relationship between Judaism and Christianity, and pressing into that and the history and hopefully the future of
Yeah.
that as well. And so then when I finished my doctoral program, I took a trip to Israel with a friend,
Yeah. Yeah.
during which I was introduced on a blind date to a man named Yonah, who ended up being my husband. And
Yes.
he
You're
had
married to the Holy Spirit, huh?
uh,
Yonah? The
yeah,
dove? Sorry,
right,
I didn't mean to interrupt.
exactly. No, yeah, some
Yeah.
people say pigeon, so sometimes we call him
Oh,
pigeon because that's like a bad translation. Dove is like much more, like
gotcha.
spiritual.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
But yeah, so he's dove, not pigeon. Let's go with that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so Yonah, my husband, was raised in the Messianic Jewish movement in the States and then
Yeah.
had made Aliyah, had moved to Israel right after high school, basically. So he was very committed to living in the land of Israel. And, I write
Yeah.
about in the book that wasn't part of my plan. And that was a big part
Yeah.
of our, dating relationship, was wrestling through not only the relationship itself, but what that implied geographically.
Yeah.
And so we dated long distance for a year. We got married. I did move to Israel. We ended up spending about the first 2.5 years of our marriage in Israel, and then very unexpectedly relocated back to the States.
Yeah.
And we have 2 kids, and we're living day by day. So that's the
Yeah.
in a
Yeah.
nutshell version.
Well, is it safe to say you're sojourning? I mean, well, maybe you're
Sojourning.
not sojourning when you're from California, but could feel like it, right? Maybe it feels
It
like it for
does.
Yonah.
It does.
Yeah.
It feels like it on a
Yeah.
lot of levels, like not only
Yeah.
geographically, I mean, certainly geographically, but I think that we are spiritually sojourning as well, for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. That's not a bad thing if you're a follower of
No,
Jesus, right? We're all sojourning, and
that's
to
right.
some extent, yeah, in some degree. Well,
Yeah.
I'm not Jewish, and I tried to convince my wife that we should move to Israel for a couple of years so I could go to school, and that was not happening. So I can totally relate to
Yep.
the
Yep.
difficulty. There's so many places we could go, but I want to start with. So it sounds like God's really on the move in your college when you're in undergrad. You
Mm-hmm.
get saved as a senior, or you recognize, you come to faith in Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
um, and yet you grew up in a Jewish home,
Mm-hmm.
mostly non-religious. Is it fair to say, or like low? Yeah,
I mean, it's
slightly religious.
interesting. Yeah,
Yeah,
it might be worth unpacking that a little bit. I mean, my mom was very tied to the Jewish community and Jewish practices and Jewish life growing up, and
yeah,
she brought that
yeah,
into her marriage. And my parents ended
yeah,
up in like this little Northern California town where there wasn't a lot of Jewish community, and so she worked very
yeah,
hard to keep that alive in our family. My
yeah,
dad was more kind of like the spiritual but not religious type, where he was pretty
yeah.
jaded with a very hypocritical, shallow kind of Judaism that he had grown up with, and he
Okay,
sort of wanted
yeah,
nothing to do with that but wanted to raise us, and he had different spiritual influences throughout his early years, but he wanted to raise us with a very strong sense of God and God's presence and belief in God, this sort of
yeah,
elementary theology that was probably at some level connected with Judaism but not necessarily explicitly so. So I do feel like I had both a religious foundation in terms of my Jewish identity, but also a spiritual foundation in terms of what my dad had always tried very hard to instill in us, which was a relationship with God, quite frankly. And
yeah.
it was a bit non-contextual.
Huh.
So there was
Mm,
some building blocks there, but they got put
yeah,
together in a new way in college. That's for sure.
yeah. I mean, I would you say that that has something to do with how the Jewish people have maintained such a strong identity as a people through
Mm-hmm.
so many years of exile and not having a homeland, is the fact that so much of their cultural identity is centered around faith in God and the
Mm-hmm.
practices
Mm-hmm.
that they adopted from their ancestors that were centered around worship and
Mm-hmm.
God.
Yes, yes, absolutely. I mean, it's really only
Yeah.
since the Enlightenment, so the last few hundred years, that we have
Yeah.
this phenomenon of secular Judaism. I mean, that was
Right.
never a thing before the
Right.
Enlightenment. So the Jewish people, I mean, are the covenant people of God. And so, one example of
Yeah.
that is with regard to the Sabbath, which has, Shabbat in Judaism, which has
Yeah.
always been a
Yeah.
centerpiece of Jewish religious life to this day. And there's
Yeah.
a very famous saying that says more than the Jewish people have kept Shabbat, Shabbat has kept the Jewish people. And it's
Mm,
getting at exactly this phenomenon that you're talking about, which is that
yeah.
this lifestyle, this way of life that has necessitated
Yeah.
community and commemoration of weekly and annual, festivals and events, um, has very much,
Yeah.
I think, preserved the Jewish people throughout
Yeah.
the centuries. And I think there's
Yeah.
something very theological about that.
Yeah. Absolutely. Actually would kick myself if we didn't talk about Shabbat at some point before you go, but we'll get
Mm-hmm.
to it. There's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
things I want to unpack about that and about how uncovering sort of a deeper sense of Jewish identity has helped you become a better follower of Jesus. But
Mm-hmm.
before we go there, I want to sort of trace maybe or begin to trace the outline of the book and talk about this early church event that happened. It's really where the book starts.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think many Christians don't realize or don't really think about the fact that Christianity started out as a Jewish sect.
Mm-hmm.
It was exclusively Jewish for the first number of years.
Mm-hmm.
And yet within maybe 100 years of the life of Jesus, you have someone like Ignatius of Antioch,
Mm-hmm.
who I loved, by the way. Like my first
Mm-hmm.
week in div school, probably my first week reading Ignatius, I was like, oh man, I love this guy. I
Mm-hmm.
don't remember the quote that
Mm-hmm.
you mentioned in the book, which is 100 within maybe 100 years of Jesus's
Mm-hmm.
life, you have this prominent church father saying it is monstrous to talk of Jesus Christ and practice Judaism.
Mm-hmm.
This is what you call the parting of the ways.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's been called that before. Can you just sort of explain what the
Mm-hmm.
parting of the ways is? And if you can, why? Like, what were the
Mm-hmm.
circumstances around this? And why did Christianity and Judaism almost become these like opposing forces in
Mm-hmm.
what, the second century?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, I think it was a gradual process, and it's interesting to start sort of where you started, which is that I would say many Christians, most Christians are not taught so much about this history. And because of
Yeah.
the parting of the ways, whereby Judaism and Christianity become these entirely separate, mutually exclusive religious traditions, I think
Yeah.
it's kind of common in Christian circles to think that Judaism has probably nothing to do with Christianity, right? It's kind of lumped
Right.
together with those other religions. Um, and I like how John Howard Yoder, the Christian ethicist, put it, that he
Hmm.
calls Judaism a non-Christian religion. You can't
Huh.
just lump it together with all of these
Yeah.
other, non-Christian religions. And there's something really
Wow.
profound there. And I
Wow.
think we have to dig into this process called the parting of the ways in order to sort of understand how these religious communities and religious traditions become so separate,
Yeah.
and to sort of be reminded and awakened anew to the fact that, as you said, in the New Testament, that is not the case. That the New Testament
Yeah.
is a very Jewish, set of documents, and we're talking about a very Jewish Messiah with very Jewish followers and a very Jewish
Yeah.
message. And I think
Yeah.
that is what has so often gotten lost in this process of the parting of the ways and the aftermath of that. So, I mean, as you said, Jesus
Yeah.
is the long foretold Messiah of Israel. Everything
Israel. Yeah.
about him and his identity and his actions and his death and resurrection is completely embedded within this ongoing story
Yes.
of God's covenant with the people of Israel. We see
Yes.
his early
Yes.
followers are Jewish. It's really not until the book of Acts where we begin to see this prominent theme of Gentile inclusion, where Gentiles, non-Jews, are
Right.
accepted into covenant relationship with God through Jesus as
Right.
Gentiles without having to become converts to Judaism. And there's a lot of controversy about that when we read Paul's
Yeah.
letters, when we read the book of Acts, where you have the Judaizers, right, which are part of the Jewish
Right.
community, saying, no, like, if you want to be in covenant relationship with the God of Israel, you become Jews. You take on the
Right.
covenantal practices of Jews, which actually makes a lot of sense, right? I mean, that's sort of
Sure.
how it had
Sure.
always been. And
Sure.
yet we see something radically new taking place in and through Messiah. And so I think
Right.
in the book of Acts, you already have a few things. You already have, and let's say the New Testament more generally, you already
Yeah.
have Jews and Gentiles together figuring out what it looks like to side by side and jointly follow the God of Israel through,
Yes.
his Messiah, Jesus. And I
Yeah.
think you already have some seeds of tension and hostility there, right? So you have Jesus coming against the Pharisees. You have some
Yeah.
kind of, I don't want to say persecution, but you have some kind of aggravation among the Jewish leadership in the New
Yeah.
Testament towards these
Yeah.
Jesus followers.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things that's so important to say about that context is that it's always been at the heart of Judaism for Jewish leaders and Jews more generally to debate and argue about what it looks like to properly follow God and to
Yeah.
properly,
Yeah.
live out a life of Torah observance, which is what Judaism
Yeah.
has always been built upon. So I
Yeah.
think that if we extract these kind of, let's say, these clashes between Jesus and the Pharisees from their historical context, um, it looks like him against them, right? It looks
Right.
like this new thing called Christianity against this old thing called Judaism, whereas
Right.
really that's not what it is. It's an intra-Jewish debate, which is what has stood at the heart of Judaism since the beginning and still does. Rabbis are always debating with each other, and that's what we have in the New Testament. We have Jesus, who's a Jewish leader, or Paul, who's a Jewish leader, debating with other Jewish leaders. And so it's
Yeah.
very within this even kind of Second Temple cultural context for those kinds of debates to be happening.
Yeah.
And so you have some seeds of difference, you have some seeds of discord, I would say, but it's not until, as you mentioned, that we get past the New Testament era into the patristic era
Yeah.
where those seeds really begin to grow into
Yeah.
a much more robust sense of separateness. And you have
Yeah.
a couple factors that go into that. I mean, you have the series of Jewish revolts against the Roman Empire,
Yeah. Yeah.
whereby it becomes increasingly a liability to be a Jew or to be associated with Jews in the
Mm-hmm.
Roman Empire. And you have
Mm-hmm.
simultaneously, Paul is the apostle to the Gentiles. What we see is that the
That's
gospel
right.
begins to spread quite rapidly among Gentile communities. So you all of a sudden have this core Jewish Jesus following community that's being quickly outnumbered by Gentile
Right.
followers of Jesus, at the
Right.
same time that it's becoming a liability to affiliate with Judaism. And so that's part of what we
Right.
see kind of in this in this sort of churning time period where the communities begin to define themselves over against one another. So you get people like Ignatius of Antioch, and you get people like
Yeah.
Justin Martyr, who are now saying, what it means to follow Jesus is to sort of be done with all of that Jewish stuff.
Right.
And you get a
Right.
real, I mean, even early on, you get a real sense of triumphalism in Christianity.
Yeah.
That again, it's so interesting to me
Yeah.
because I call it the shadow side of Christian history, because I feel like so many Christians and seminarians are learning about the church fathers, and we could fast forward, right? Are learning about Martin Luther, for example, and just never hear about this aspect of their thought, which may not have been as much a part of their legacy, but it was certainly very influential in the strides that they took to both create and perpetuate the parting of the ways. And you have the same thing happening from the like proto-rabbinic Jewish community, what becomes of the Jewish community after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, which is also the Jewish community beginning to sort of stomp out any kind of place within it for Jewish followers of Jesus. So you kind of have both communities doing this process together. And there's been scholars who have argued that that's been such a key part of their own process of self-definition, is over against the other in terms of liturgy, in terms of practices, in terms of community structure, etc. And again, I think it's a process. I think it happens gradually, and I think that there's historical evidence that even in the 6th, 7th, 8th centuries, the split is not final yet. So I don't think it was, I mean, I think there were seeds of tension in the New Testament, as we've said, but I think it wasn't finalized until much, much later. And really the rest is history, right? The rest is the legacy that we all have inherited of these two totally separate religious communities.
Right. Perhaps maybe there was a golden opportunity at the time of the Reformation to correct some of these things, but unfortunately it seems like it was just piled on and made worse than maybe it ever was before. And you make a great point in the book when you say that if that line had already been clearly drawn in the sand, then Ignatius would have never felt the need to say what he said about that you can't speak of Jesus and practice Judaism. You see all these other examples, like people always do kind of tend to group like Pharisees, right? Pharisees are like the bad guys. They're like the enemies of Jesus. And yet there's numbers of examples of Pharisees who became followers of Jesus in the New Testament. I mean, even when you get to the book of Revelation, which I know is like a controversial book sometimes to bring up, you see, what do you see? You see the 12 tribes of Israel on the new temple, and you see the names of the 12 disciples of Jesus. So I guess my question, the next logical question, or if I was listening to this and thinking along, I would say, well, if the disciples didn't intend for Judaism and Christianity to be two completely distinct things, if say Peter and Paul were sitting here having a conversation with us and they're like, no, Christianity and Judaism are not like two completely distinct things, which honestly, I don't see how they can be, because there is no such thing as Christianity without the Messiah, who is descended from the line of David, and who, I mean, his entire story and his coming is seen through the Old Testament, through the Tanakh. But if that's not what they intended, what do you think they did intend? If we could go back in time and sit here and, or maybe better yet, let's bring them to like current day so they could see everything that happened. What did they intend? Like, what does a faithful community of Jews and Gentiles look like working together?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a great question, isn't it? I mean, and it has different contours if we imagine either scenario, right? Like us traveling back in time to them, or them like time traveling towards us. Because I think one of the really interesting things about the latter scenario of like bringing them into our day is dealing with the church history, with what has happened, and the fact that you can't just go back, right? You cannot erase what's happened. And I think any attempt to do that, which I think there are communities who are like, we're just going back to the first century, like it's a bit disingenuous. You can't do it. You can't undo church history. You can't undo rabbinic Judaism and rabbinic tradition. We have to sort of live in light of these separate traditions. And so, I mean, just to sort of take a stab at a few thoughts on that. Yeah. I do think that in the New Testament, there is the precedent for, and I write about this in the book, and Mark Kinzer, who I mentioned is this mentor of mine, has written a lot about this as well, I do think that there's a precedent for Jews following Jesus looking a bit different than Gentiles
Yeah.
following Jesus. And a key
Yep.
moment that we see this in the New Testament is the book of Acts, in Acts
Yep.
15, where the Jerusalem Council is convened to ask this very question. Do
Yep.
Gentile followers of Jesus have to basically become Jews and live as Jews in order to follow
Right.
Israel's Messiah? And the council debates about it, which I always ask like my Christian students and friends and stuff, just to
Yeah.
pause there. Like, what a
Yeah.
crazy question in our context, right? I
Yeah.
don't think any
Yes.
Christian today, like if you
Yeah.
become a Christian, I don't even think it's
Yeah.
at least for most people, like within the realm of consideration about whether or not you would begin, taking on Jewish practices. But that's the
Yeah.
question that they're wrestling with
Yeah.
in Acts 15. And
Yeah.
the council ends up deciding no, Gentiles do not have to take on
Right.
Jewish practices and a Jewish way of life.
Right.
Which of course assumes that Jews were still doing that stuff, right? It wouldn't be a question
Yes.
if Jews had sort of left all that behind, which I think is how the New Testament is often read. Like Jesus, or if
Right.
not Jesus, then certainly Paul, right? He kind of like out
Right.
with the old, in with the new. And I think
Right.
Acts 15 shows us really clearly that wasn't the case. So that's the
Yes.
first point. I think you have a precedent of Jews and Gentiles having some kind of different practice. I think there's a lot of speculation among scholars about what that might have looked like practically and
Hmm.
concretely in a first century
Hmm.
setting.
Yeah.
Um, but within that kind of separate, and not even separateness, just distinction is probably the word that I would use, that the
Yeah.
distinction between Jew and Gentile endures in the body of Messiah. You
Yes.
also have this remarkable witness of reconciliation. So
Yes.
throughout the Tanakh, or the Old Testament, what we
Yeah.
see is this constant theme of tension and strife between Israel and the nations. Israel and the
Mm.
nations. Those are like these two categories of people
Yeah.
throughout the Old Testament. And it ain't good, right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
always like the
Yeah.
nations who are dragging Israel away from their covenant relationship with God, dragging them into idol worship, fighting
Yep.
over land with the Israelites. And so I think one of the remarkable things that we see in the New Testament and through the coming of Messiah is a real profound reconciliation, whereby now, rather than Israel and the nations warring against each other, as we've seen so often throughout our
Yeah.
Bibles, they are together
Yeah.
worshiping the one true God, together side
Yeah.
by side worshiping the
Yeah.
God of Israel. And we see this prophesied, right? I mean, Isaiah prophesies about, in that day, Egypt and Assyria will be alongside the people of Israel. And
Yeah.
so we have these glimpses throughout the Old Testament of this, and it's really what becomes a reality in the New Testament. And you can
Yeah.
almost argue that in some sense, for Israel and the nations to worship the God of Israel side by side and to
Yeah.
manifest this very powerful reconciliation between them, there almost has to be a distinction between them, right? If
Yeah.
Jews become assimilated into the churches and lose all sense of Jewish identity, then you lose that. You lose the richness of Israel and the nations being reconciled in the
Yeah.
Messiah. So that all might
Yeah.
sound a little bit abstract, and we can kind of drill down into the particulars of that, but those are the
Yeah.
first kind of big picture things that come to mind with the question that you're asking.
Yeah, I know it's a massive question. It's like asking you to solve all the world's problems.
Right.
And you make a point in the book of saying, "Hey, like this book is meant to raise questions and get you to
Mhm,
think, not so much
mhm,
necessarily provide concrete answers." But yeah, I mean, you see this thread all through the Tanakh of one day you're going to be a light to the
mhm,
nations, even in the covenant that God makes with Abraham. I
mhm,
will bless those who bless you, and in you all the nations of the world will be
mhm,
blessed. And
mhm,
I I love even when the baby infant Jesus is brought to the temple, there's an older, very prophetic, very faithful man there to not only declare who he is and speak words of blessing to his mother, but you will be a light to the Gentiles.
mhm,
I mean, you
mhm,
see it foreshadowed, even though there's this great amount of mystery involved in
mhm,
it too. Ephesians 2 is like really used a lot today to sort of um, talk about like situations that are going on in the world, maybe, or in
mhm,
American culture. But I love looking at it as best as I can in its original context,
mhm,
and looking at the fact that here the dividing wall of hostility has been torn down.
mhm,
Jew
mhm,
and Gentile are being formed into one new man. And oftentimes we just read over that and we say, see, it doesn't really matter if you're Jew or Gentile anymore. None of that
mhm,
matters.
mhm,
And clearly that's not the case. What we're
mhm,
saying, what is being said is that in Christ, Jew and Gentile are being grafted, made into one new
Mm-hmm.
person. Well,
Mm-hmm.
grafted, that's the language of Romans. And
Mm-hmm.
I always ask people, like, do you realize that in your New Testament, it actually says if you're a Gentile, not to be arrogant toward Jewish
Mm-hmm.
non-believers in Jesus? Like, it actually
Mm-hmm.
says that.
Right.
Don't be arrogant toward natural branches. Does that like register or make you think about anything at all?
Uh-huh.
Like, you wouldn't have a Messiah if it weren't for this amazing story that God's been writing
Mm-hmm.
with and through
Mm-hmm.
the Jewish people for so long. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
And again, like you said, I think verses like passages like Ephesians 2 or Galatians 3,
yeah,
where there is no longer Jew nor Greek, slave nor
yeah,
free, like it's so often used as
mhm,
like just wiping that away. It doesn't matter anymore. And I don't think
yeah,
that's the story that the New Testament or the
mm-mm,
biblical witness more
mm-mm,
broadly paints, right? I do
yeah,
think that there's something, as I said, significant about the ongoing distinction between Israel and the nations. And yet we have to be
yeah,
really careful because that sort of boasting can also go the other way. And I don't think that's what Paul had in mind, but I think that it
right,
can and it has, and it can
right,
make, in some sense, Gentile Christians feel kind of less than, right? If they're not Jewish. I've
mm,
talked to a lot of Christians who are like, well, wait a second, like we're missing out on all this richness that the
yeah,
Jewish people have. And that doesn't seem fair. So again, I
yeah,
think these are very tricky concepts and conversations, but I do think, as you're saying, we need to honor the biblical witness and that the metaphors and the
yeah,
portraits
yeah.
that the scriptures offer us to understand these very profound and mysterious realities that we live in the midst of.
Yeah, yeah. That's such a perfect segue into talking to you about the rhythms of Jewish life. But I have to ask you. So, like, since you brought up Galatians, and I'm really glad you did, I can hear that skeptical Christian who really knows their Bible well, who's sitting here listening to this, saying, "Well, wait a minute. I've read Galatians, and I know what Paul says, and I do not have to become Jewish in any way in order to be a follower of Jesus," which you would not say that you have to
Mm-hmm.
be,
Mm-hmm.
but who almost wants to take it to the point and say, see, like, there's so much that Paul was turning away from, right? There is
Mm-hmm.
this, I think it's a misunderstanding, but there's this pulling away, right? There's this, we're no longer justified by works of the law language that's used.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I know it's a big question. I have another big question, but what did Paul mean by that? If it wasn't, hey, being Jewish no longer means anything. I'm no longer Jewish. Clearly, he was a Torah observant Jew
Mm-hmm.
throughout his life. What was he talking about?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. It's a question that gets asked a lot with regard to Paul, right? And we
Yeah.
have these very
Yes.
ingrained
Yes.
lenses through which we have read Paul for centuries. And so that is the
Yeah.
go-to reading, right? And
Yeah.
especially in the aftermath of the Protestant Reformation and Martin Luther, who kind of reads his own story and his own
Yeah.
break with the Catholic Church back into
Yeah.
Paul and into Paul's,
Yeah.
perceived relationship with Judaism or alleged relationship with Judaism. And so,
Yeah.
if just to sort of back up a minute, I think this is
Yeah.
one of the reasons that the Book of Acts is so significant. And I think,
Yeah.
if we look at the New Testament canonically and the
Yeah.
way that the canon is shaped,
Mm-hmm.
it's as though the canon is instructing us to read Paul's letters through the Book of Acts, right? If we were just
Yeah.
read through our New Testament,
Yeah.
Acts comes first. And I believe in
Yep.
some theological sense, the Book of Acts lays a primer for how to understand Paul. And
Yep.
I think if we don't look at it canonically, this causes a
Wow.
lot of problems, right? Because the Paul of
Yeah.
Acts, who's this very Jewish Paul, seems quite different than the Paul of
Yes.
his letters. And
Yes.
I think that reconciling that tension needs to be a central point of the conversation. And what that we're living in this sort of reformation of Pauline studies right now, and a lot of
Yeah.
scholars are saying the problem is not with Acts being ahistorical, or that's just Luke's portrayal of Paul. The problem was
Right.
with the way that we have historically understood his letters. That's the problem. And
Yeah.
so I think if we look at it that way, and if we think about Paul very explicitly being the apostle to the Gentiles, like that
Yeah.
is who he's called to preach to,
Yeah.
it's remarkable to me how
Yeah.
reading his letters looks different and
Yeah.
how explicitly and often he states that he's talking to Gentiles.
Yep.
And so in these places where Paul sounds very negative towards law, which again
Yep.
is sort of this problematic translation of Torah, which is a much richer concept, a much more nuanced concept than this kind
Yeah.
of law, legalism, flat, negative association in Christian history and
Right.
contemporary Christianity. He's talking to Gentiles, and I think he's speaking so often against these Judaizers who are telling Gentiles, in opposition to what we were speaking about in Acts 15, that
Yeah.
they have to become Jews. And I think Paul grasps the absolute cataclysmic significance of Jews and Gentiles together worshiping side by side in the body of Messiah, that he's
Yeah.
like, no, like you do not have to. And so I think if we pay attention to his audience in those letters,
Yeah.
and there is, we don't know 100%, it's possible, Romans was written to a mixed audience, etc. But it is remarkable how tweaking our lens on Paul's letters kind of opens the door to these alternate understandings, not to mention translation issues that have perpetuated more of this sort of parting of the ways type mentality. So I think, and one of the exciting things about living today is that there's so much out there on Paul, and the Paul within Judaism camp of scholarship, which is incredible. And they're coming out with new books like every year about reading Paul within Judaism and answering these tricky questions and coming against hundreds of years of church history that has read Paul in a particular way.
Right. I think that is so helpful, Dr. Rosner, to think about the book of Acts as almost like, I hate to use the word lens because I always talk about trying to read the Bible without your modern day contextual lens. We all have lenses, right? But seeing it as a vessel through which we can understand the letters of Paul better, because you're right. He is like the epitome of a Jewish rabbi. I mean, in the book of Acts, he's teaching, and then he's coming back to Jerusalem and he's honoring the council and he's having these back and forths. And he seems to care very, very much that the apostles in Jerusalem and the council in Jerusalem are in agreement with what he's doing. He's not just this crazy rebel who's out there, throwing everything he's ever known to the wind, converting Gentiles and it's almost like he's converting heathens and teaching them that grace is a license to sin. That's the way he's painted, even though that's not him at all. He's the opposite. He
And
cares
it's
so much.
interesting. No, it's interesting that you mentioned this issue of lenses, right? We could have so many conversations about lenses and the lenses that we bring to the text, but I'll never forget my colleague David Rudolph, who's a Messianic Jewish New Testament scholar. He talks about, he's written a book on 1 Corinthians 7 where Paul says, and this is the point that he makes. He actually thinks that the New Testament offers to us a bit of a canon within a canon. It kind of directs us to texts through which we need to interpret other texts. And so he takes 1 Corinthians 7 as one of these texts where Paul says, this is my rule in all the churches. Like, it's not often that Paul says in all the churches, like kind of blanket statement like that. And he basically says, if you are circumcised, remain circumcised. If you are uncircumcised, remain uncircumcised. And of course, that language is sort of shorthand for Torah observant and not Torah observant. That's what circumcision means. It means taking upon oneself a life of Torah. And he's basically saying, Jews remain Jews, Gentiles remain Gentiles. And it's interesting because it's the rule in all the churches, and yet it doesn't get talked about that much. But it's basically Paul saying, this is bedrock, and everything else like gets worked out sort of in this larger context. Which again, my colleague David Rudolph would say that's a text that we need to then understand other texts through that fundamental lens.
Yes. I would be fascinated to read that because just hearing you talk about it, it sounds very appealing. I mean, I'm automatically thinking of other places where Paul says, I'm the one saying this, not the Lord. This isn't really like, I'm not speaking authoritatively in this moment. So that's that's fascinating.
Okay, so I think I'll say this, and maybe we can put it in the show notes if I end up being right. I think that particular argument, and David Rudolph has made these arguments in different places as well, is published as an essay in a book that's edited by Gerald McDermott called "Understanding the Jewish Roots of Christianity." Really rich book. It came out of a conference at Beeson Divinity School in 2019. So I have an essay in there. Matt Thiessen has an essay in there, who's this incredible New Testament scholar. Mark Kinzer has an essay in there. There's great It's a great resource. And I think that is one of the places where David Rudolph in a pretty concise way makes this exact argument. So we'll see if my bibliographic memory is correct, but I think that's where it is.
I'll look it up and I'll put it in the show notes, one way or the other. I'll put that in the show notes too, if it's right or not.
If I'm wrong, then you can be like, just ignore her on that one. But I think that's where it is.
Finding Messiah will be at the top of the show notes, though, just so we're clear. Hey, I know that I want to be respectful of your time, so please keep me posted if we're running late. We've already been almost 40 minutes, but I could do this with you for a long time, but I really do want to take a minute and just hear about the part of your story where becoming a Christian sort of led you back into a deeper understanding of your Jewish heritage, and how your Jewish heritage then turned around to start informing your being a follower of Jesus, and how adopting sort of a Jewish rhythm in life helped you become a better follower of Jesus, and what life looks like for you now and Yona and your family.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it doesn't really have like a straightforward cut and dry answer, but I like the way that you phrased it. I don't know that I've ever quite phrased it in this kind of circular way, right? That like becoming a follower of Jesus then kind of reignited and informed my Jewish identity, which then like reignited and informed my identity as a follower of Jesus.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a really good way to put it. And it's not to say that this kind of interval of a number of years where I was like a Christian in the Christian world, worshiping at Christian churches, that was a really rich season of life for me. I mean, that was like the beginning of my path on Christian discipleship. And I had such rich mentors who were not Jewish during that time. But I think it's only in looking back that I see why I never found like what truly felt like a denominational home. I mean, I write about in the book that I became a believer in Jesus in the context of a vineyard church. And I think to this day, like I'm very influenced by vineyard theology. And I have friends who are like, leading vineyard churches and in the vineyard denomination. And then later I would, be a part of an Episcopal church. And that really informed my understanding of liturgy and tradition and these other parts. So I think that was a really rich time. But as I look back, I'm like, it makes sense to me that none of those places ever truly felt like a spiritual home for me. And it wasn't until rediscovering the Jewish piece and kind of picking back up that thread, which had been left behind for a few years, that I was like, yes, this is who I am. And these are kind of my people in a really meaningful sense. These other like Jewish believers in Jesus who find themselves in this really tricky in-between space that history has largely erased and doesn't have a lot of room for from either side. I write about some of the experiences in Finding Messiah of just being kind of misunderstood and, in some ways excluded from these different settings because nobody quite knows what to do with Messianic Jews. And yet that's the most authentic place for me to carry out my spiritual life. So, and I mean, to sort of expand that into our practices now, I mean, we call ourselves Messianic Jews, and for me, and I write about this in the book, the most meaningful community is a community called Yachad B'Yeshua, which is an international, ecumenical fellowship of Jewish believers in Jesus from all across the ecclesial spectrum. So you have Roman Catholic priests who are Jewish, and Eastern Orthodox Christians who are Jewish, and Protestant Christians who are Jewish, and Messianic Jews, and Jews who are followers of Jesus but live completely embedded in the mainstream Jewish world, like this whole spectrum. But everybody shares this core kind of tension and marker in our identities of being Jewish followers of Jesus. And it's and something about this very international sort of diffuse community, it almost has to be that way because in our local community there isn't that kind of expression, right? So we sort of straddle between the local Jewish community and the local Christian community, each of which means so much to us, but each of which doesn't quite fit entirely. And we're so thankful for our friends kind of in both communities and our community on both sides of this sort of division. But it's a bit of a reminder of, the ruts left by history and the gap left by history that we, in some sense, always live within.
Yeah. It's this, this sort of divine tension that exists, right?
Uh-huh,
Between these two
uh-huh.
worlds, and you're caught in the middle.
I mean, that's very much how it feels. And in some
Yeah.
ways, I think it's a divine tension. There's something very rich about it, and there's something excruciating about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it is what it is. It is where we find ourselves. And I think
Yeah.
because of that, it makes me so thankful for this sort of fellowship of people who are in
Yeah.
that same place.
Yeah. Yeah. In so many ways, it reminds me of, can't remember if we were talking before or if it was part of our earlier conversation on the podcast, but that, we're all sojourning, all of us followers of Jesus,
Hmm.
and in many ways are sojourning in this world. And
Hmm.
there's like this, we're
Hmm.
home, but we're not home yet. Right.
Hmm.
There's a
Hmm.
future home that's waiting for us. And
Yeah.
one of the things that you bring out, and I just love this because I've never quite heard it phrased this way, is the way that Judaism really wrestles with and is able to live in the tension of
Hmm.
certain things that we encounter in scripture and in life that
Hmm.
oftentimes Christian theology just tries to sort of like sharpen the edges, right? And square things off and say, this is
Uh-huh.
this and that is that. And I really encountered that in my own spiritual journey because, like you, I grew up in more of a charismatic West Coast church culture. And then, and we really cared about the Bible, but like theology and Reformed theology and a lot of these things were
Mhm.
not a part of our language. Going to divinity school and being in this world of, like on one hand, you've got these really, really smart, really intellectual scholars who are, sort of like not sure what they think the Bible is. And then you've got these really reformed, we know exactly what we believe the Bible is, but we also have every single question that you could ever possibly have, we have an answer to. And in my years of like really delving into Reformed theology, I finally like got to the point with God where I was like, I don't know what I believe. I don't know if
Mhm.
I believe you're sovereign and I believe that you've given me free will, but I don't know what to do with it, Lord. And
Mhm.
maybe I'm just going to have to be okay with that. And God was like,
Mhm.
yeah, maybe you should just
Mhm.
trust me. And then, and then a totally different, being in a completely different place and different season, God sort of taking the scales off my eyes and realizing, don't you realize that there's tension that I want
Mhm.
you to live in because I'm not just a person in a book. I'm a living God
Mhm.
that wants to actually be in relationship with you. So
Mhm.
live in the tension.
Mhm.
Don't be so quick to answer every question and dot every I
Mhm.
and cross every T that you forget that there's an actual God that wants to know you. You
Mhm.
bring that up in the book and talk about how in Judaism. Sorry, that was sort of a long rabbit trail. I
No, it
know.
was great. I loved it. Like amen.
Yeah, I mean, in Judaism, like there's this okayness with
Mhm.
with living in the
Mhm.
tension of certain things,
Mhm.
and I
Mhm.
really love that. And I can see that's a part of your life, but it
Mhm.
in more ways than one. But praise
Mhm.
God for it because He loves getting us out of our comfort zones and then watching us grow, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting to look at Christian tradition, and church history makes Christianity into this creedal religion, right? It's
Yeah,
so, and I love the creeds. I do. I really love the creeds,
yeah,
but
yeah,
they're so Greek in some ways. They're so
yeah,
wanting to kind of pin down categories and these like sort of capture these abstractions. It's funny. I have a friend who's leading a community in Israel, and
yeah,
he has a beef like a bone to pick with the creeds because they're basically
yeah.
impossible to translate into Hebrew. Like they just don't make any sense in
Oh,
Hebrew. So it's
wow,
almost as if they have to
wow,
be like these Greek
yeah,
informed traditions. And I think it's so natural, as you said. I
yeah,
think as Christians, that's just the air that we breathe is this
yeah,
creedal tradition.
yeah.
And that is
Oh,
so the
so
opposite
true.
of Judaism. Like Judaism is
Yeah,
not a creedal tradition. Judaism is an
yeah.
orthopractic tradition where it is about what it means to be a Jew by and large is what we do with
Yeah,
our bodies, what we do with our time, how we structure our lives and our
wow.
priorities. And it's very kind of down to earth
Yeah,
and nitty gritty.
yeah,
And it's not creedal. And so, I teach at a number of Christian institutions, and there's this big buzzword like deconstruction, right? And there's all this talk about
yeah,
deconstruction. And I feel like that's such a threatening concept. Whereas I think oftentimes it's a really good thing, not
yeah,
not in I mean, I think people get nervous because it can sort of leave one a bit rudderless, but I also
Yeah.
feel like it
Yeah.
can open us up to exactly the kinds of things that you're talking about, which is maybe getting outside the boxes a little bit that Christianity
Yeah.
has really encouraged. We have to say it's not just like us; it's this tradition that Christianity, inherits and perpetuates. And so I think, again, brushing up against Judaism can be really refreshing in that way. And I
Yeah.
think if you look at the history of the Jewish people, man, there's a lot of wrestling with God. And there
Oh
has to
man.
be. I mean, how do you be a Jew
Beautiful.
after the Holocaust? Like, how do you
Yeah.
go on? And this is why I find people like Elie Wiesel and some of these voices to be so
Mm.
inspiring, because it's just as raw as it gets, isn't it? There's
Yeah.
no creedal categories after the
Yeah.
Holocaust. And so
Yeah.
to kind of come up against that, I feel like can be a very like a breath of fresh air to these kind of tidy answers
Yeah.
that we like to have.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really beautiful. I I would love to talk to you more about like the Jewish rhythms of life. I think if there was probably one thing that that understanding Judaism and the Jewish roots of Christianity and Scripture more, like if there was something like that people could hone in on, I would say just look at the rhythm of Jesus's life. Just look at the rhythm
Mhm.
of his life and how he lived day to day. And if you think that like it's so intricately connected to his Jewish
Mhm.
identity, but it's in this world that we live in where everything is so fast paced and
Mhm.
something's dinging at us all the time. It's like I can't even get
Mhm.
up and pray and read my Bible without my phone ringing and 47 alerts and
Mhm.
social media. And
Mhm.
but I do want to ask you. This is going to be the last question because I know we got to wrap
Okay.
it up. When it comes to there's one element of Jewish life that I know is on the minds of people, at least that I talk to. I have friends that I'm in active dialogue with this about, and it's Shabbat. It's Sabbath.
Mhm.
Um, I know as a practicing Messianic Jew, you practice Shabbat, and if I had to guess, I would say you probably. Well, I don't know what you would say about should Gentiles practice Shabbat, but
Mhm.
I think the reason that it's such a live question is because, like, if you just water it all down and look at, okay, the Ten Commandments or creation,
Mhm.
this is
Mhm.
embedded into the creation story. This idea of resting and this idea of Shabbat, this
Mhm.
idea of taking one day to slow or bring all the other rhythms of life to a stop and just be present with the Lord.
Mhm.
Um, and even if you're completely as Gentile as it gets, which as far as I know, I'm as Gentile as it gets. Um, there, I can't help but look at just the Ten Commandments and say to myself, there's not one other thing in the Ten Commandments that I would even consider um,
Mhm.
not keeping as like thinking of as something that doesn't apply to me. And
Mhm.
yet with Shabbat, it's different, right? It's
Mhm.
like it's
Mhm.
in Acts 15, the Jewish council doesn't write to the Gentiles and say, hey, don't eat things offered to idols, don't eat blood, don't be sexually immoral, and keep Shabbat. They don't say that. I wish they would have said that because it would have made
Mhm.
life a lot easier. But
Mhm.
what do you say
Mhm.
when it comes to your experience with Shabbat, Gentiles, and Sabbath?
Mhm.
I'm just I'm going to throw you the hot potato and let you take it.
No, it's a great question, and it's a very complex question. I mean, in the book
Yeah.
in general, I'm not trying to offer easy answers, and I am trying to encourage people to live into the tensions. But at some point, it's like, okay, where does the rubber hit the road here? And I think Shabbat is a really natural go-to for this kind of
Yeah.
question about
Yeah.
application, practical, concrete application. But I
Hmm.
don't think it's so straightforward. So I'll just kind of share some thoughts on it. I write about in the book how I have all these Christian friends who are in ministry, and they're like, oh, Tuesday's
Yeah.
my Sabbath. Oh, Thursday's my Sabbath, which I
Yeah.
get. I
Yeah.
totally get the intention and even the necessity behind that. But I contrast that to the Jewish notion of Shabbat, where Shabbat is Shabbat. And like, we don't
Yeah.
choose which day it fits in best into our schedule. In fact, the entire Jewish community forever and ever,
Yeah.
anywhere in the world, like revolves around Shabbat. And that's nowhere more clear than in Israel, where, stores and restaurants shut down for Shabbat,
Yeah. Yeah.
or in Jewish communities, in LA or New York or wherever else. And so there is something about that is really profound. And as you're saying, it's built into the fabric of creation. It's the longest of the 10 commandments. And yet I
Yeah.
think it's not So people are like, okay, Jen, well, then why don't you just tell Christians that they ought to keep the Jewish Shabbat? Like,
Yeah.
why don't you
Yeah.
take that leap? And part
Yeah.
of it is because of what we were speaking about earlier, which is that we cannot erase church history. We can't go back to a first century
Yeah.
setting.
Yeah.
And part of what develops throughout the history of the Christian church, and for
Yeah.
very good reason, is the Lord's Day, right? Christians
Right.
worshiping on Sundays. I mean, we see this
Yep.
already in the New Testament as a commemoration of the resurrection of Messiah. And so
Right.
Christians gathering on Sundays, I think, is not only like a very sacred thing, but it's also
Yeah.
just become such a part of Christian life, right? So
Yeah.
so we
Yeah.
have to honor that. And I honor church history, and it later becomes kind of a political um intentional move to distance
Yeah.
Christianity from Judaism, in this process of the parting of the ways, such that
Yeah.
Sunday is like explicitly not Saturday and not the Jewish Shabbat. But I
Yeah.
don't think that we can say, oh, well, that was all political and Constantine was a pagan and all these things. Because I think that for Christians, probably since the New Testament and certainly today, Sunday is this really key day. So
Yeah.
I'm not going to denounce that or take away from that or say anything bad about that, because I think it's a really amazing, beautiful
Yeah.
thing. And so I think it depends. I mean, I write in the book that I think every
Yeah.
Christian can learn from this kind of Sabbath ethic, right? The notion of, like you
Yeah.
said, like
Yeah.
taking a step away from the busyness of everyday life, and not using technology and not working, and
Yeah.
whatever that looks like. And it looks like a very specific set of practices in the Jewish community, at least the observant Jewish community. So this kind of Sabbath ethic, I would say, yes, I would encourage every Christian to sit with that. But I'm not going to tell Christians what that necessarily needs to look like, number one, because I think this conversation always has to be had in light of Sunday as the Lord's
Yeah.
Day, on the day in which
Yeah.
Christians gather to worship.
Yeah.
And I think it looks different for different Christians. I think different Christians have different contexts and callings and communities whereby it may or may not make sense to sort of
Yeah.
engage in a more Jewish looking Sabbath. So
Yeah.
again, I think it's just one of these questions that doesn't have such a black and white answer, but I love the question being raised. I
Yeah.
love, and I think there are Christians who write about just those kind of principles of not
Yeah.
having our week revolve around deadlines and productivity, but sort of reorienting that, which is, of course, what
Right.
Shabbat's all about. But I'm not going to
Yeah.
sort of be prescriptive about what that needs to
Mm-hmm.
look like for each and every Gentile Christian, because I
Mm-hmm.
think, I just don't think it's quite that simple.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think that if a Gentile decided to start keeping Shabbat in a very Jewish sort of way, Saturday or Friday evening, no technology, things like that, do you think that they would be running the risk of maybe stepping over a line that they shouldn't step over? I don't know if you can answer that. I couldn't resist following up because these are the things that I know people are
Yeah,
wrestling with.
it's
I keep
tricky.
throwing you impossible questions to
No,
answer.
they're great. There's such good questions. These are my questions.
Yeah.
And I do think you raise a really important point, which is the Jewish community, for very good reasons, if we understand the history between Judaism and
Yeah.
Christianity, is really uncomfortable with anything that sort of sniffs of appropriation, right? Of
Yeah.
Christians kind
Yeah.
of taking and oftentimes like maybe sort of bastardizing these really
Yeah.
rich and fundamental Jewish traditions. So this conversation comes up a lot with the
Yeah.
specific issue of like Christians having Passover seders, like that, or
Yeah.
trying to sort of take their own spin on Jewish holidays. Like that
Yeah.
really kind of riles up a certain segment of the Jewish community who's like, no, like just leave us and our holidays alone. And
Right.
again, we'd
Right.
have to really dig into the hostility that a lot of Christians
Right.
aren't so aware of between Jews and Christians in centuries past to
Yeah.
understand that. So I think it's an
Mhm.
interesting question. And I think a lot of it, I mean, to your specific question, depends on the posture with which one is doing these things. And coming
Yeah.
back to like the Romans 11, like what's the heart
Mhm.
behind it? Is there a desire to show unity and solidarity with the Jewish community, or is there
Yeah.
this more like supersessionist, maybe triumphalistic,
Oh.
kind of
Mhm.
appropriation mentality of like, oh, those Jews and their legalistic Shabbat, we're gonna do the real Shabbat, which is focused on Jesus, or whatever.
Right. Right.
I think it
Right.
depends a lot on how one is doing that. I know plenty of Christians who have taken on a more Jewish Shabbat, and the heart behind it is so pure. And
Yeah.
to be perfectly honest, there might still be Jews who would be offended by that, but I certainly wouldn't. And I would say
Yeah.
that's beautiful. And if that's meaningful in your family, that's great. But
Yeah.
again, I'm not prescriptive about it because I don't
Right.
think that's true for
Right.
every person.
Yeah.
And there is such a tricky history there that I think we always need to bear in mind with these kinds of issues.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Dr. Rosner, this has been such a great conversation. And every time I ask you a question and you say something, there brings up like 47 more questions that I want to ask. You just mentioned supersessionism, triumphalism. We didn't even get to talk about that because I think that's something that Christians do really need to understand. I mean,
Mhm.
we could do a whole podcast on the history of these things and 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 much more. But then also the way that the book walks through these individual sort of Jewish traditions, traits, and how
Mhm.
those have added to your life as a follower of Jesus. I mean, all of them. We could do podcasts on all of them, but I just want to thank you for coming on this time. An extended invitation if you ever want to come back. You pick the topic and we'll do it because we'd love to have you.
Well, thank you. It's so meaningful to have like forums to have these kinds of conversations. And maybe it's a good thing. Maybe there's something there to say that, there's always
Yeah.
something left to talk about.
Yes, yes, that's right. And again, her book came out yesterday. We're recording this a week early, but her book came out yesterday. The release of your book is the 24th, right? October 24th?
May
Or I'm
24th.
sorry, May 24th. So
You're
this
way
airs
ahead of the
on May
game.
25th, way ahead of the game. Finding Messiah, A Journey Into the Jewishness of the Gospel. I can't recommend it highly enough. Thanks again for coming on.
Thank you.